All right, hey, we're going to cover European exploration and conquest here in our first lecture for Western Civ 2. Hopefully, everybody can hear me and see me. I'm here in my wonderful little office. You can check it out. All right, but when we're looking at we're looking at reasons why the Europeans, or really anyone for that matter, is going to go explore, go someplace that's going to be uncomfortable or someplace new. And we're not talking about like today where you go out, let's say, like you go camping and you spend a couple weeks out on a trail or whatever, and you're trying to just put yourself in an uncomfortable state just to kind of shake things up. We're looking at a situation where these explorers are going to voyage thousands and thousands of miles from their home with the very real possibility that there's a possibility they're not going to come back. So we look at Europe in roughly 1500, 1450. Uh, and compared to a lot of the rest of the world, Europe takes a long time to get going. It's underdeveloped. Asia and China and India have pretty advanced societies well before Europe does. Africa obviously has some advanced societies that we touched on in Western Civ 1. But overall, after the fall of the Roman Empire, it takes Europe about 1,000 years to kind of catch up. And like not only do they catch up, but they surpass a lot of the world um, in technology and knowledge of different things. There's definitely more intelligent civilizations out there, but compared to Asia, Europe during the Middle Ages is kind of underdeveloped, and Asia has all of the good stuff. Specifically, they have spices, and that's what is really going to motivate Europe, the kings of Europe, to sponsor exploration and trade. And so they're trying to gain access to luxury goods, things like porcelain, spices, rare metals, those types of things. Um, there's a couple of events that are going to really kind of kickstart this age of exploration. The first one is going to be, of course, the Renaissance, which we talked about in Western Civ 1. That gets cut off right here, where you start to see a change in thought in Europe away from this idea that the Christian church, or what will become the Catholic Church, knows everything and is correct, and the earth doesn't move and it's on a flat plane. To this idea that possibly we live in a heliocentric universe, and the earth revolves around the sun, and if that's true, well then why couldn't the planet be around like maybe the Greeks thought? And so that Renaissance, what Renaissance actually is just the rebirth of Greek and Roman ideas, or the reintroduction of past learning into society. And when that comes in, the people's worldviews start to change. And so in 1350, 1450, there's a new way of thinking about the world. And then there's a huge situation, a huge development in 1453 that is really going to, for my money, is going to be the catalyst. It's going to start modern times. And that is going to be the fall of Constantinople. Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, um, roughly around 200 AD. The Roman Empire splits. Um, the power of the Roman Empire leaves Rome and goes to Constantinople, and they establish the Byzantine Empire that's going to kick around until about 1453. And if we look at our map here, right here in the middle of this is Constantinople. You can't find it on a map today because now it's called Istanbul. It's in Turkey. Constantinople's, or Istanbul, is one of the interesting cities in the fact that it's the gateway to Europe. It sits in between Europe and Asia. And if you look here on this, you can see the travel routes. And Constantinople, when it was controlled by the Byzantines, who were Orthodox Christians, there's a split between Catholicism in Rome and Eastern Orthodox, but they're still Christians. Um, and it was really the only area or the trade route that was still controlled by Christians that opened up access to Asia. And so all the Asian goods, most of the Asian goods that came to Europe would either come through Constantinople or they had to go through what we would consider the Middle East today, like Damascus and Antioch and those places. And those are going to be controlled by Islamic governments, Islamic forces. And so the powers of Europe, as Europe starts to develop, they start to look for ways to, run more and more trade through Constantinople. But then in 1453, the Turks conquer Constantinople, and now Muslims control all of the trade routes between the Middle East and Asia. And they act as this middleman between the Middle East, between Asia and Europe. And so Europeans are very concerned that they're not going to be able to get things like pepper. And if you can't get spices, then, hey, maybe life isn't all that great. I don't know if you've ever had to eat biscuits and gravy without pepper, but like it is not fun. And so you can see here are the Turks as they conquer the famous walls of Constantinople. And so it creates this new challenge for the European monarchs and the rulers in Europe on how to get the stuff that they want. And they're very fortunate because up until the 1400s, Europe doesn't really have a ship that's capable of crossing oceans, transcontinental travel. If you look here on our original map there, you can see that, really the furthest that you're going to have to sail is across the Mediterranean Sea. And, you don't need a necessarily huge boat to do that. But in the 1400s, you start to, like we talked about, you start to see the rebirth of ideas and the exchange of ideas between ancient Greek and Roman thought and Europe. And a lot of that is facilitated through the mixing of cultures between the Islamic cultures, Islamic scholars, and the Christian scholars of the day. And so the Europeans start to steal some of the ideas that were prevalent in the Middle East, or along the Arabian Peninsula. And one of those is a caravel ship. And caravel ships are an interesting ship. They're a little bit smaller, a little bit narrower, but they they use a triangular sail for travel, and so that allows the ship to either go into the wind or sail against the wind and still move forward. And until the 1400s, Europeans don't have that technology available to them. Another Middle Eastern technology that's going to come around is the astrolabe or the astrolabe, however you want to pronounce it. And this is just a simple device. You take a reading based off of, I believe, the North Star, one of the stars, and it will tell you your latitude on the globe. And so it gives you a more precise location for sea travel, which is pretty important if you've ever been in the ocean at night or the ocean during the daytime. You have no idea where you are. It looks all the same around. And then finally, Europe has a really confused picture of the world. We said that Europe was Europe for a lot of the first 1500 years after in the Common Era is really kind of just a backwash of civilization. It's not advanced to the places like Asia, even some of the Middle Eastern empires. And so, often Europe is confused on, they're not sure if Asia is one whole nation, if it's run by one person. They hear rumors about the Mongols. They hear tales of China from people like Marco Polo that travel to China, tales of India, but they really have no idea what's out there. And you can look at this map from roughly 1500 of what Europe believe the rest of the world possibly could look like. You can make out, Great Britain over here and Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, and all of those things. But Asia, Africa, I think Japan would be represented somewhere over there, and so you have some inconsistencies on what the world actually looks like. All right, sorry, I had to do a quick pause there. But you can see that, this is what Europe thinks the rest of the world looks like. They have some good ideas really up until, that crease right there, and then they kind of fall off. And so if Europe is unsure of what the rest of the world looks like, how does exploration take place? All right. Well, one of the ways that exploration takes place is that Europe is going to trade, obviously, for gold and ivory, and they're kind of unsure of where it comes from. And this is kind of a little side note that we're going to take, but like one of the world's largest producers of oil at the time was the Empire of Mali. And so Mali mined so much gold that in the 1300s, when its leader or its emperor king, Mansu Mansa, um, did his Hajj to Mecca because he's Islamic. He's a Muslim. And so he goes to Mecca as one of the five pillars. He takes so much gold with him that this caravan of camels that leave from Central Africa and they walk across to modern day Saudi Arabia and Mecca, that it takes days for the camels to they appear, and then it would take them days for the whole caravan to cross a certain point. He spends so much money and hands out so much gold to people on his way to Mecca that historians can actually go back today and they can trace the inflation of that money going into the local economy. And so here's our Malian Empire, Mali Empire, in Timbuktu, and you can see the trade routes are all moving to the coast, and so you have salt that's come up this way, and gold and ceramics and all of those things. So all of those routes are going to move to the coast. And so one of the ways that Europe is going to capitalize on this is that a nation like Portugal is going to establish sailing schools, and they're going to go out and they're going to try to explore the west coast of Africa. Because, all right, hey, if we can get all of this great stuff, maybe we can go back and we can get, I'm sorry, I'm just going to go back here. Maybe we can go back and get these spices. Maybe Africa has spices. We don't know, And so Portugal starts to set up these trading posts along the coastlines. They try to go into interior Africa, and they quickly find out that there's diseases that kill people off. And so Portugal is going to set up, colonies or small trading posts along what's going to be the west coast of Africa, right? And eventually, in 1497, so a little bit after Columbus, one of the sailors for Portugal is going to get blown off course, and he's going to go around the Horn of Africa. And then Da Gama is going to come around, I'm sorry, in 1497, and he's going to actually plan a voyage around the Cape of Good Hope down there and the Cape of Africa. And so he takes 4 ships, and along his journey, he loses 2 of his ships and half of his crew, which, you go today and like that would be a huge disaster. But they come back and they make so much money with just 2 ships full of spices that it's ludicrous not to continue. One of the ways that you can look at how much money was to be done in spices, if you look at a regular dinner table pepper shaker, so just like one it's that big, you just put it on your fried chicken or whatever you're eating for dinner that night, right? One of those containers of pepper was the equivalent of a yearly wage. And so it doesn't matter what the yearly wage was in 1497 or what it is in 2022, but let's just say that, hey, it's, average person makes, $45,000 a year, which might be low, might be high, I'm not sure. But like in 2022 and 1497, a dinner table pepper shaker would be worth about $50,000, $45,000. And so there's lots of money to be made in trade. And so there's Da Gama, and there's his trip around. And so one of the interesting things that when we go and we look at this, one of the things that is going to spur this trade is the fact that Africa, if we go back, where are we at? Here we go. Africa has a pretty substantial slave trade that they've had for a long time. And so these Western port cities that Western African port cities that Portugal starts to control, starts to see an increase in the slave trade. And then when Portugal starts to sail out and explore these areas, there's a bunch of little islands out here in off of the west coast of Africa that are very good for growing crops like sugarcane. And sugar is a delicacy in Europe. And I know that we think it's all crazy. Like, you go to the grocery store right now and buy a pound of sugar for a couple dollars. A pound of sugar back in 1497 would make you a very, very wealthy person. And so if you could find a way to produce sugar other than through like beets, which are processed, and it takes a lot of energy to produce sugar that way. If you could find ways to sweeten your food, you can make lots of money. So Columbus really was no stranger to this slave trade and even to the Canary Islands off of the coast of Africa. He's been there. He's gone as far as Europeans feel comfortable going at this time. And in 1492, Columbus comes up with this idea that he could reach India if he would just sail west. We go back to our map of what our scholars think of in the 1500s, and all we got to do is just leave off of Spain here, which eventually Columbus will do, and just sail west, and then eventually we'll pop around and we're going to hit India, and it's all going to be good. And so Columbus goes to basically everybody trying to pitch his idea. He goes to the French, he goes to the British, goes to the Italians, the different Italian city-states that are around at this time. And then he goes to Spain and presents his ideas to the Spanish. And so, Queen Isabella is a huge Queen Isabella of Aragon is a huge Catholic, and she believes that it should be the role of Spain to spread Catholicism or spread Christianity throughout the land. Ferdinand is swayed by the ideas of financial possibilities of making money. Like, look at what Portugal's doing; they're making all this money. We go back to our pictures here on the left. You see Columbus getting his original charter. This is a painting, and then obviously here's on the right he's coming back, and you can see the things that he brought. Well, over here in the bottom middle, you can see the gold that he's bringing back, and some of the flowers and all the things. But then he also has people, and he's going to introduce those people to Christianity, and that's going to fulfill his promise to Ferdinand and Isabella. And so Columbus sets sail in August. He lands in the Bahamas somewhere in October. He goes a total of 4 times across the sea. And that's important because Columbus is going to, quote unquote, discover the new world, or he's at least going to he's going to do the introduction between the old world and the new world. And his findings are going to allow the Spanish to build a huge global empire. But that empire is going to be built on brutality and disease and human bondage and force and destruction that we're going to talk about here. So we look over here on the left, and there's Columbus getting off his boat, and that's kind of one of the images that we get drilled into our head, at least in the United States, of Columbus. And he comes over and he finds these natives. They're relatively peaceful and they all get along. Over here on the right, there are passages from Columbus's own diary in which, the natives are forced to work in the gold mines for the Spaniards. And if they don't meet certain quotas, then they're punished in various ways. And one of the ways is that they would chop their hands off. And then they would require them to get as much gold as they did with one hand as they were asked to for 2. And so you can see in the portrait here, you have the Spaniards cutting off the hands of the natives. And so that's something that we can visit at a later date or a later time if we want. But that's important. Those things are important. The way that those cultures combine and come together, and the brutality of the Spanish. But what's really going to come out of the discovery of the New World is two things. It's just the availability of land, and then just the exchange of ideas of cultures. And so this exchange of ideas of ideas and goods and people and diseases and foods and beliefs is going to be collectively known as the Columbian Exchange. And so from the New World's going to send food that they were growing in Europe to I'm sorry, the New World is going to send food that they're growing in Europe in the New World in the Americas, South America, to Europe to try to grow. And so they're going to introduce corn and potatoes, chocolate, tomatoes, tobacco. Those are all things that weren't native to Europe that show up, roughly in 1492, roughly in 1500, right? And so you go back and you look, think of think of how many things corn is in your diet, or how many calories you get from potatoes. And hopefully nobody here is smoking tobacco, but it was very fashionable in the 1500s. Tomatoes and corn and potatoes are all integral parts of your diet. And then chocolate. I mean, if you don't have chocolate, what's the point? And then Europe is going to send things to the New World, and they're going to introduce horses. And horses had originally come over to to the New World. Uh, it's believed through the Bering Strait land bridge, but then they had died out, and so the reintroduction of horses and sheep and goats and cows, and so you start to see livestock introduced into the New World, and not only livestock but forms of protein that weren't there before. Rice becomes a huge market commodity. In the Caribbean and along the southern coast of the United States. Rice plantations pop up, and we increase the ability to grow calories. Wheat to make bread, sugarcane, which we kind of talked about with the Canary Islands. Sugarcane becomes very popular in the Caribbean, and it results in lots of different things. It really kind of fuels this whole slave trade, where the majority of majority of slaves that are forced out of Africa into the New World are going to end up in the Caribbean working on sugarcane plantations or working on sugar plantations, because life expectancy is so low that labor forces had to be constantly renewed. Europe is going to introduce coffee beans to the New World, and they're going to grow them, and it turns out that it grows really well in certain places. But the most largest effect that Europe is going to have on the New World is going to be the introduction of disease. Diseases like yellow fever, smallpox, the flu are going to wipe out huge portions of the native population. On Columbus's first visit to the New World, he stopped at the island of Hispaniola, which is modern-day Dominican Republic in Haiti. 5 years after Columbus's first contact, the population of that island had been decreased by 99%. So Columbus basically wiped out everybody that lived there, not necessarily through force or military force, but through disease. Some diseases are going to come to Europe from the New World. Probably one of the big ones that shows up is syphilis, which wasn't in Europe before New World discovery. And then Africa to the New World, we're going to see a huge introduction of slaves. And these are people that are taken against their will. They're forced into slavery and forced into bondage, into a system of chattel slavery in which they're seen as property. The New World, Europe is going to send guns and mostly guns and money to Africa in exchange for those, for slaves, for people. And you can kind of see here a chart of our items that are going from North America and South America. You see like beans and corn, peanuts, turkeys, squashes, tomatoes, those types of items. Things that are going to come from Europe and Africa, like bananas and sugar cane. We talked about coffee, rice, wheat. Cattle and horses are big ones. They come over and they provide some kind of a livestock protein for things. And so these exchanges of foods and goods and ideas are going to bring a lot of changes, especially to Europe. You're going to see an increase in variety of crops that are grown in Europe. So if one crop fails, you're not going to have a huge famine. A lot of the crops that are sent over are easier to grow. Corn's relatively easy to grow. It's pretty hardy. It sticks around for a long time. And corn is also really packed with calories. And so all of a sudden, the life expectancy um, in Europe increases dramatically within, 100, 200 years. Um, you see the size of the populations of countries um, reaching the same levels that they had before the bubonic plague, which wiped out two-thirds of Europe, and then surpassing it by the mid to late 1700s, early 1800s. And so Europe goes from being underpopulated to be overpopulated very quickly. And one of the reasons for this is not that people were having more kids, um, but the fact that people were living longer. And more people were living longer. And so, like during this time frame in Europe, if you made it into your 30s, there was a pretty good chance you were probably going to live into your 50s or your 60s. But there's really probably, it's almost like a coin flip if you were going to make it that long because of disease and your body's probably in a weakened condition because of malnutrition. And now all of a sudden, you're going to introduce things like corn into diets, or you're going to introduce, you know, tomatoes or squashes or things other than bread, other than wheat, that are going to bring about a more rounded diet, and people are going to live longer, and that's going to change populations. Changes to the New World we're going to talk about. You're going to see the fall of empires. We kind of talked about the introduction of disease, killing off huge portions of population, somewhere in the neighborhood of 90. I've heard estimates of 70 to 90% of the native populations in the New World die very quickly within, 5 or 6, a decade of introduction to Europeans. You see a destruction of culture, and there we go. So we see here how smallpox gets transmitted. Um, the one native on the left, she has smallpox, and the lady on the right comes to try to help her, make her feel better. She ends up getting smallpox and passes away. Changes in Africa, you see a huge depopulation in Africa. Slaves are typically sold for guns, which emboldens more tribes to go out and try to conquer their neighbors. For a long period of time, slavery was relatively common, and slavery is relatively common in the human history. But in Africa, it was more of a ransom type thing, like where your tribe goes and you fight somebody else and you take prisoners, and then you hold Steve prisoner until they pay X amount of dollars, or goats or chickens or whatever the currency was at that point. As trade increases with Europe and Europeans are willing to trade guns for African slaves, more African tribes begin to trade for slaves for guns. And then those slaves are relocated away from Africa, and they're away from their family, from their tribes, from their villages. And so therefore, the only way that you could really kind of ensure that your tribe was going to be successful and be around was to strengthen it through trading trading prisoners for guns, so that you could defend yourself against the people that do have the guns. And so it's kind of a vicious circle there, where you need guns to protect yourself, but then you have to sell your prisoners into slavery to get more guns. The passage between Africa and the Americas is referred to as the Middle Passage. That would be the transatlantic passage. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 15% of all slaves died in that crossing. You could be chained to a boat in the cargo hold of a boat from anywhere from 1 to 6 months. And from the 1500s, really until 1500s until the 1800s, 1830s, something like 12 million Africans are removed from the continent of Africa and brought over to North and South America. And you can kind of see there, the vast majority of African slaves are going to end up in either the Caribbean or in Brazil. Um, of course, the United States is gonna get a pretty fair share um, of African slaves as well, and we can talk about that in American history. African slaves were used to replace native slaves in or native the native workforce in rice and sugar plantations. Both of those, rice and sugar, are very labor intensive. They're also very prone to disease because of the wet climates that rice and sugar cane grow in. And so mosquitoes were very prevalent, and then bloodborne pathogens um, are easily transmitted. One of the reasons that they choose to use African slaves over native slaves are that first of all, natives were forced into Christianity, um, or they could convert, and the Pope said that you couldn't have a Christian as a slave, and so therefore you eliminate part of your labor force that way. And then also the natives could just run off if they wanted, if they could escape. They knew the land, they knew the languages, they had allies. Even if they get relocated to a different area, natives probably have a similar culture to where they are, and you could escape into other native tribes. Whereas African slaves that come over don't have that knowledge, don't have that ability to blend into society, I guess. And so you have that. Plus African American or African slaves had been introduced to a lot of the European diseases by that point. And so when Africans come over, they don't have the same death rate as the native population does. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't see outbreaks of yellow fever or smallpox or whatever in the slave populations, but you also see those in regular populations as well as with the European populations as well. So there's a number of advantages, the number of factors that were working against Africans in this slave trade in this slave trade triangle. Okay. Portugal begins to build their empire in Africa and India, and once Columbus discovers the New World, they get all upset because they think Columbus is closing is messing with their trade route to India, and so the Pope actually divides the globe in 1949 or 1494, and he gives everything east of this line to Portugal. And so that's how Portugal ends up with Brazil, and then the rivers and whatever, and however they decide boundaries there. But you can see that Portuguese Empire, which we started off right here, on the west coast of Africa and then into India, grow pretty substantially into the New World. Oh, I'm sorry here, I've drove by that. So you still have all that and into the New World. Remember, Portugal is a relatively small country, not a huge population. They're not going to send out a number of people to colonize those areas. They're going to do that through trade. The Spanish, on the other hand, have a population to go out, and they're going to try to conquer this New World. And they start to send over military units. They're going to refer to these as conquistadors to convert the natives into the Spanish kingdom. And these conquistadors are going to go out, and they're going to be searching for a couple of different things. They're going to be looking for what the historians are going to refer to as the 3 Gs: God, glory, and gold. And so they're going out looking for gold. They're trying to discover gold mines, trying to steal gold from the natives. They're trying to convert the native population to Christianity, and they're trying to win individual glory. And we get back to our original ideas of the Renaissance. One of the ideas is the individual glory of man that wasn't like pride during the Middle Ages that was seen as sinful. During the Middle Ages or during the Renaissance, personal achievement kind of comes into vogue. And so people want to go out and be the first to do different things. The first person to circumnavigate the world is going to be Magellan. And he tries to find a westward passage through Latin America, and he ends up sailing around the coast of South America, uh, and through the Pacific. Interesting thing about Magellan is he actually doesn't make it all the way around the world. His troop does, his group does, and his sailors do. Excuse me, but Magellan is actually killed in the Philippines due to a tribal dispute, and so the Spanish conquered the Philippines because of Magellan, and they're going to use it as a naval port to link together Asia and the New World and Europe and all of those things. So there's Magellan. Comes around here to the Philippines, and then he's actually he's killed right here, and then sails all the way around. Cortez, if you're going to look up conquistador in the encyclopedia, you're going to see a picture of Hernan Cortez, and he overthrows the Aztecs. There he is on the left. There he is, conquering the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan on the right. One of the ways that he does that is he uses a translator by the name of Malachi, who was from one of the rival tribes of the Aztecs. So she's one of those female figures that kind of gets lost to historians or to history. Doesn't get brought up a lot. She's later goes on, has a child from Cortez. They never actually marry, but does have a child. And when Cortez and his men originally show up, they're welcomed into the Aztec capital with like open arms. And it's later figured out that they're probably up to no good. Some historians argue that the Aztecs might have believed that Cortez and his men were gods, and then it quickly turns out that they're not. And so they get forced off of the island city of Tenochtitlan, and Cortez regroups, uses some of the Aztecs' neighbors that aren't in such great relationships with the Aztecs, and they eventually overthrow the Aztecs and Montezuma and take control of what's going to become modern-day Mexico. There's Cortez and Malinche, and there's the city of Tenochtitlan. Okay, why was Cortez so successful? How can 45 men on horseback? Why can they conquer a huge one of the largest civilizations in humanity? Like we look at this kind of looking at this like, obviously the Europeans were very superior in technology, but like the Aztecs had a huge city. It's probably one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Have a large empire, and how could 45 men on horses just ride in and destroy it? Well, the first one is that the Aztecs were just very, very unpopular. One of the reasons that they were so unpopular is they demanded a daily human sacrifice for the sun to rise and set, and they killed tons of people in ritual sacrifice. Most of them are going to be prisoners from neighboring tribes. We had already talked about disease, and by the time Cortez gets there, what are we looking at for Cortez? It's like the 1520s. So, you're looking 20 years after first contact. And so the Aztecs are going to be wiped out from probably multiple waves of things like smallpox and influenza, and large percentages of their original native population, pre-contact population, are going to be gone. Horses and military weapons, the ability to fight on a horse really helps the Spanish in any time of combat. And then also the Aztecs had this end of world belief in which when their god, they had multiple gods, but the one that was going to come back and get rid of the earth was Quetzalcoatl. And when he returned, he was supposed to be gray like ash and have two heads. Well, if you've never seen a man on a horse before, and you see a guy riding in, well, it's feasible to believe that, hey, this guy has two heads, or they're one person. And so, modern scholars kind of dispute this idea, but the fact that, you have disease and huge percentages of the population are wiped out, and things are going very, very poorly. yeah, maybe give some credit to the fact that the gods are mad and the gods are going to destroy you. And then all of a sudden you have a guy that shows up with ashy white skin and looks like he has two heads because he's riding a horse. Well, it's not too big of a jump there. Okay. There's our human sacrifice, and we'll have a reading about that. Pizarro was also a conquistador. He had actually been with Cortez and worked with Cortez, um, and had made tons of money in Latin America by overthrowing native cultures and stealing and doing all those things. And he decides he's going to just keep on trucking on, and he goes into South America, and he runs into the largest empire in the New World, which is the Inca Empire. And the Incas had just undertaken this long civil war. Um, and so they have a new ruler at Hulapa, at Hulapa. Uh, and basically they create this meeting. They're going to get together and they try to convert this Inca ruler to Christianity with no explanation. They just hand him a Bible. The Incas don't have written language. Actually, they communicate through an intricate series of knots, which is colored ropes and knots, which is kind of interesting. And so he looks at the book, and Atapula just throws it on the ground, and Pizarro uses that as a sign of disobedience or disrespect to the Christian God. And so they capture him and they demand an entire building full of gold and silver from the Incas. And the Incas have to respond to this because they view their ruler as God incarnate on earth. And so they give Pizarro all this money, and Pizarro just goes ahead and kills their leader anyway. Okay. And that's just it's too much for the Inca Empire to handle, and they fall apart. They fall subject to the Spanish. And so within 50 years of discovery, the Spanish have overthrown the Aztecs, they've overthrown the Incas. They control Central America. They're going to control all of South America except for Brazil. And when I say control, I mean it's difficult to control those regions because they're so mountainous, and but they can pretty well do whatever they want. And so we look at our map here, and those areas of red are those areas that are going to be controlled by the Spanish in the New World. Those orangish areas are going to be part of the Spanish Empire as well. And so the Spanish at this point have the largest world empire by a long shot. And so one of the ways that they're going to build wealth from this empire is they're going to exploit the natural resources of those areas. And they find gold mines and silver mines throughout the New World, in places like Bolivia and different places. And they're going to force natives and then eventually African slaves to go into these gold mines and silver mines and mine the natural resources. And they're going to take all of that wealth and they're going to send it back to Spain. And you would think that would it makes the Spanish extremely happy, right? But one of the things that it does is when you have too much money in your economy, it causes inflation. And that's one of the things that we're going through now in the American economy is that we had a bunch of stimulus checks come out to people. And so they have a lot of money that they can spend. And you couple that with the fact that in America, we just had COVID shutdowns. And so like supply chain issues and whatnot, we're providing a situation where people had money to spend but no products to buy, which causes prices to rise. The same thing is going to happen in Spain. Obviously, we don't have the Spanish of the 15, 16, 1700s don't have the advantages that we do in commodity production with the development of the Industrial Revolution. But all this new gold and silver goes into Spain, and the Spanish economy just kind of almost falls apart because they don't have to cultivate trade with other nations. They don't have to find things to trade because they're making so much money off of just raw materials coming in, raw resources coming in. They don't have to create new technologies because they have slavery, and so you have free labor, and whatever they're taking out of the ground is valuable. And then one of the other things that they do is they get rid of a lot of religious and ethnic minorities in Spain. They kick the Jews out of Spain, the people that practice Judaism. They kick Muslims out of Spain. And a lot of the Jews and the Muslims were the skilled artisans or even like the scholars of that society. And so once inflation reduces the value of gold and silver, um, the Spanish Empire really, really struggles, and so we're going to see that as the French catch them and bypass them, and then the British catch and bypass the Spanish as well, in terms of global importance. And so I got a little bit here. Um, the Spanish treated the natives as subhumans. One reason because the Bible didn't explain about the New World, right? And so how do you explain that? Well, it's obviously the work of the devil. Um, and so by 1527, the Pope has to come out and be like, hey, natives of the New World are not the devil incarnate. But if you want to force them to convert to Catholicism, that's fine. Um, and then one of the other things that's going to happen with the Spanish Empire that's going to be different than when we look at like the British Empire or even the French Empire to a lesser extent is that most of the Spaniards that are going to come to the New World are going to be men. You're going to look at people like Pizarro or Cortez or just the conquistadors in general, and they're going to come and they're coming to the New World to A, get rich, and B, get famous. And so what they want to do is make a whole bunch of money, get a whole bunch of fame, and then move back to Spain and live out the rest of their life in a pretty sweet situation. And so like they're not moving to the New World to set up a life. And one of the reasons that they don't do that is because all the land is going to belong to the king. And so if the king owns all the land, there's really no reason to move your wife and family over here because the king could just take your land at any point. And so a lot of single guys would come over, or even married men would come over by themselves and plan to stay for 2, 3 years and then return back home. And so that doesn't lead to developments of farms and those types of things that are going to take place, especially in the British colonies. And then you also see, laws that prevent the interbreeding and marriage of Spanish and natives. I guess laws prevent the marriage. There's still going to be a lot of fraternizing between the Spanish and the natives, and you're going to have a large population of mixed race people, and a pretty strict social order that exists in the Spanish colonies. That's really not going to affect where we're going with this. So we'll just kind of leave that there. So that's our first chapter 5 talk. I hope I didn't bore everybody too much. And I will see you guys in chapter 6. Have a great day.